Route 47 rolled through downtown Phoenix like clockwork every morning, carrying office workers and students to their daily destinations. The driver behind the wheel moved with the same steady rhythm he had for 3 years, checking mirrors, calling out stops, helping elderly passengers with their bags. Nothing unusual about Robert Martinez except for one thing that morning, something that made a transit supervisor freeze when she saw it through the security monitor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When the hijacked delivery truck screamed toward the I-10 bridge packed with enough explosives to level 6 city blocks, and 23 passengers trapped on Bob's bus found themselves directly in the blast zone, everyone discovered that the man they'd been mocking for driving too carefully had been preparing for this moment his entire life. What happened next turned a quiet Monday afternoon into 47 minutes that would redefine what it means to protect and serve. The radio crackled at 2:47 p.m. with a sound that made Emma Chen's coffee cup pause halfway to her lips. Not the usual chatter from Route 47, not Bob Martinez's calm, measured voice reporting passenger counts or requesting maintenance checks. This was different, sharp, precise, military. Dispatch, Bus 1247. I have visual on hostile vehicle approaching from the northeast, approximately 400 meters from target structure. Recommend immediate evac protocol, for all units in Sector 7 through 12. Emma stared at the radio like it had grown legs. Bob Martinez, the same Bob Martinez who took 30 seconds longer than any other driver to pull away from stops. The Bob Martinez who checked his mirrors so methodically, that passengers sometimes groaned audibly. That Bob Martinez was using tactical language she hadn't heard since her days coordinating supply lines in Afghanistan. She grabbed the radio. Bus 1247, this is dispatch. Can you clarify your last transmission? Static filled the control room for 3 heartbeats. When Bob's voice returned, it carried the weight of absolute certainty. Emma, I need you to trust me right now. Clear all emergency channels and patch me through to Phoenix PD Tactical. We have approximately 6 minutes before this situation goes critical. Through the security monitors, Emma watched the feed from traffic cameras positioned along the I-10 corridor. A white delivery truck was weaving through afternoon traffic at dangerous speeds, forcing cars onto shoulders and jumping lanes without signaling. Normal road rage behavior, maybe a drunk driver. Except Bob had called it a hostile vehicle. Bob had used the word target structure. Emma's hands moved across the dispatch console with muscle memory from her military days, opening emergency protocols she hadn't touched in civilian work. Something in Bob's voice had triggered every instinctual alarm bell her training had installed. She'd heard that tone before, in voices that belonged to people who saw death approaching and knew exactly what to do about it. The morning had started normally enough. Bob Martinez arrived at the Metro Transit Authority depot at 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes before his shift like always. He wore the same navy blue uniform shirt, the same worn work boots, carried the same dented metal thermos that never left his side. His hair showed more gray than black now at 58, and his face carried the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades outdoors, but his posture remained straight, his movements deliberate. Bob nodded to the security guard, punched his time card and walked through the depot with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. Other drivers were already clustered around the coffee machine, voices mixing complaints about traffic patterns with weekend sports scores. Bob poured coffee from his thermos into a small cup, checked the duty roster, and headed to Bay 12 where Bus 1247 waited for its pre-trip inspection. Derek Thompson was already there, clipboard in hand, pretending to check fluid levels while actually scrolling through his phone. Derek supervised the maintenance crew, and served as the unofficial union representative, a position that gave him plenty of opportunities to voice opinions about everything happening in the depot. When he spotted Bob approaching, Derek's expression shifted into the familiar smirk that usually preceded some form of commentary. "Morning, Bob. Ready for another thrilling day of driving like you're hauling nitroglycerin?" Derek's voice carried across the maintenance bay, drawing chuckles from 2 younger mechanics working nearby. "I swear my grandmother moves faster in her wheelchair." Bob ran his hands along the bus's exterior, checking for damage or loose panels, his expression unchanged. He'd heard variations of this comment roughly 800 times over the past 3 years. Derek had a talent for turning routine interactions into performance opportunities, especially when he had an audience. Just making sure everyone gets home safe, Bob replied, his voice carrying no edge, no defensiveness. He continued his inspection, checking tire pressure and testing the emergency door mechanisms. Mike O'Brien, a driver barely 2 years out of training, laughed a little too loudly at Derek's joke. Mike had learned quickly that aligning himself with Derek's commentary was safer than becoming its target. Bob, I keep telling you, the speed limit's a minimum, not a maximum. These buses can handle more than 15 miles per hour. Bob finished testing the wheelchair lift and made notes on his inspection sheet. Every item checked, every system verified. The same thorough process he'd followed for over 1,000 shifts, never skipping steps, never cutting corners. Other drivers sometimes joked that Bob treated a city bus like a military vehicle, but they said it with the tone people use when they think something is mildly ridiculous rather than potentially significant. Sandra Kim emerged from the dispatcher's office, radio in hand, scanning the duty assignments for the day. Sandra had worked dispatch for 7 years and prided herself on knowing the personality quirks of every driver in the fleet. Bob Martinez was predictable, reliable, and completely unflappable. She'd never heard him raise his voice, never seen him argue with difficult passengers, never received a single complaint about his conduct. If anything, his only notable characteristic was an almost obsessive attention to safety protocols. Bob, you're on Route 47 today. Full crosstown run should be standard Monday traffic. Sandra handed him the route sheet and passenger manifest expectations. Emma's covering dispatch, so you'll be dealing with the new girl. Bob folded the papers and tucked them into his shirt pocket with the same precision he applied to everything else. Understood. Any special circumstances I should know about? Nothing unusual. Construction on Van Buren might slow things down around noon, but that's typical. Sandra was already moving to
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Toward the next driver, her attention shifting to the dozen other buses preparing for morning routes. Emma Chen watched this interaction from the dispatcher's office, taking mental notes about the drivers she'd be coordinating. Emma had been promoted to dispatch supervisor just 6 weeks earlier, after working her way up from customer service. Her background in military logistics made her naturally suited for managing complex transportation schedules, but she was still learning the personalities and patterns that define daily operations at Metro Transit. Bob Martinez intrigued her, though she couldn't articulate why. Every other driver brought some form of personality to their work. Derek Thompson was loud and opinionated. Mike O'Brien was eager to prove himself. James Wilson, the veteran driver, told stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Bob simply did his job with a level of quiet competence that seemed almost military in its precision. Emma had served as a logistics coordinator with the Army National Guard, managing supply chains and transportation routes in both domestic and overseas operations. She recognized discipline when she saw it, and Bob Martinez moved through his daily routine with the kind of systematic attention to detail that spoke of serious training. Most people attributed his methodical approach to either excessive caution or the slow reflexes of age, but Emma saw something different. The way Bob inspected his bus wasn't casual maintenance checking, it was tactical preparation. The way he positioned his mirrors wasn't about vanity or regulation compliance. It was about maintaining complete situational awareness. The way he interacted with passengers wasn't just customer service, it was threat assessment and crowd management. But Emma kept these observations to herself, suggesting that Bob Martinez, the famously careful bus driver, might have a military background would only provide Derek Thompson with fresh material for his ongoing commentary. Besides, plenty of veterans worked in civilian jobs without broadcasting their service history. If Bob preferred to keep his background private, that was his choice. Bob completed his pre-trip inspection and climbed into the driver's seat, adjusting mirrors and testing communication systems. The radio squawked with morning chatter from other drivers reporting their status and requesting route updates. Bob listened but didn't contribute unless specifically asked for information. His thermos sat in its usual position within easy reach, and his inspection clipboard was secured in the designated holder. At exactly 6 a.m., Bus 1247 pulled out of the depot and began Route 47's first run of the day. The route covered 32 miles of Phoenix surface streets, connecting residential neighborhoods with downtown business districts, shopping centers and medical facilities. It was a diverse route that served everyone from minimum wage workers heading to early shifts to elderly residents, traveling to doctor appointments. Bob drove with the same steady rhythm that had earned him Derek Thompson's mockery and passenger complaints about slow service. He checked mirrors every 15 seconds. He came to complete stops at every stop sign, even when no other traffic was visible. He left following distances that other drivers considered excessive. He helped every passenger who needed assistance regardless of how much time it took. What looked like overcautiousness to casual observers was actually something else entirely. Bob Martinez was mapping threats, calculating escape routes, and maintaining tactical readiness for scenarios that no one else even considered possible. Every intersection was evaluated for potential ambush points. Every passenger was assessed for behavioral anomalies. Every vehicle that followed the bus for more than 3 blocks was noted and monitored. For 3 years this had been Bob's routine. Get up before dawn, drive Route 47 with military precision disguised as civilian caution, endure workplace mockery from people who had no idea what they were looking at, and go home to a small apartment, where he lived quietly and drew no attention to himself. But on this particular Monday morning, as Bob Martinez guided Bus 1247 through its first passenger pickup of the day, forces were already in motion that would shatter his carefully constructed anonymity, and reveal exactly why a man with his particular set of skills had chosen to spend his days protecting the people of Phoenix, one bus route at a time. Emma Chen finished her second cup of coffee and settled into what she expected to be a routine shift managing radio traffic and coordinating with maintenance crews. She had no way of knowing that in less than 9 hours, she would be coordinating with federal agencies, military tactical units, and emergency response teams across the southwestern United States. And Bob Martinez, checking his mirrors and calling out the first stop of Route 47, had no way of knowing that the quiet life he'd built was about to end, because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and sometimes being a hero isn't a choice you get to make. The Phoenix Metro Transit Authority depot sprawled across 4 acres of concrete and steel on the edge of downtown, housing 97 buses that served a metropolitan area of nearly 5 million people. The facility operated around the clock, with 3 distinct shifts managing everything from routine maintenance to emergency repairs. Morning shift brought its own rhythm of coffee-fueled conversations, radio chatter, and the diesel rumble of buses warming up for their daily routes. Bob Martinez had been part of this ecosystem for exactly 3 years, 2 months and 16 days. Not that anyone kept track except Bob himself, who maintained mental records of details that most people would consider irrelevant. He knew that Bus 1247 had logged 147,000 miles since entering service, that Route 47 averaged 38 passengers per run during morning hours, and that the depot's coffee machine had been broken for 6 days before anyone bothered reporting it to maintenance. These weren't the observations of someone with too much time on their hands. They were the automatic data collection habits of someone trained to notice patterns, anomalies, and potential problems before they became critical situations. Bob's mind cataloged information constantly, sorting and filing details that might prove relevant in circumstances that hopefully would never arise. The depot's social hierarchy had crystallized around Bob's perceived limitations rather than his actual capabilities. Derek Thompson had established himself as the unofficial spokesperson for driver frustrations, and Bob's methodical approach to everything provided Derek with reliable material for workplace entertainment. Other drivers had learned to expect Derek's commentary whenever Bob was nearby, and most had chosen to participate rather than become targets themselves. James Wilson, who'd been driving for Metro Transit for 12 years, understood workplace dynamics well enough to stay neutral in Derek's comedy performances. James had served briefly in the Navy during peacetime and recognized something familiar in Bob's bearing, but he'd never pursued the observation. Military service was common enough among transit workers that it didn't seem worth mentioning, and Bob clearly preferred to keep his background private. Mike O'Brien represented the newer generation of drivers, hired during Metro Transit's recent expansion phase, Mike was eager to fit in and advance his career, which meant aligning himself with established personalities like Derek Thompson. Mike genuinely believed that Bob's careful driving style was a liability during busy periods, and he'd begun volunteering for routes that Bob typically handled, positioning himself as a more efficient alternative. Sandra Kim managed dispatch operations with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to juggle competing priorities without losing track of essential details. Sandra appreciated Bob's reliability because he never created problems that required her intervention. In 7 years of dispatch work, she dealt with drivers who showed up late, drivers who called in sick suspiciously, drivers who argued with passengers, and drivers who ignored safety protocols. Bob Martinez did none of these things, which made him valuable regardless of his driving speed. The depot's physical layout reflected decades of practical modifications and budget-conscious additions. The main building housed administrative offices, driver facility, and the dispatch center. Maintenance bay occupied a separate structure connected by covered walkways. Fuel pumps and bus storage areas filled the remaining space, creating a complex environment where vehicles, equipment, and personnel moved in carefully choreographed patterns throughout each shift. Emma Chen's office overlooked the primary dispatch floor, giving her visual access to radio operators, scheduling coordinators, and the electronic displays that tracked every bus in real time. Emma had requested this office location specifically, understanding that effective management required constant awareness of operational status. Her military experience had taught her that information delays could cascade into serious problems, especially in transportation systems where timing affected thousands of people daily. From her window, Emma could observe the morning routine that played out with remarkable consistency. Drivers arrived in clusters based on shift schedules, gathered around coffee stations and duty rosters, then dispersed to their assigned vehicles for pre-trip inspections. The entire process took approximately 45 minutes from arrival to departure, and Emma had begun noting individual patterns within this larger framework. Bob Martinez arrived 15 minutes earlier than required, and completed his pre-trip inspection with systematic thoroughness that exceeded regulatory requirements. Derek Thompson arrived exactly on time, and performed inspections that met minimum standards while maximizing opportunities for social interaction. Mike O'Brien arrived 10 minutes early, and rushed through inspections to allow more time for networking with supervisory staff. These behavioral patterns interested Emma, because they revealed priorities and decision-making processes that might become relevant during stressful situations. Emergency response training had taught her that people defaulted to their established habits under pressure, which meant that understanding normal behavior was essential for predicting crisis performance. Route 47 presented unique challenges that made it an ideal testing ground for driver capabilities. The route connected Phoenix's historic downtown district with rapidly developing suburban areas, requiring navigation through both congested urban traffic and residential neighborhoods with school zones and elderly pedestrian populations. Morning runs included commuters heading to office buildings, students traveling to Phoenix College, and service workers beginning early shifts at hotels and restaurants. The passenger demographics changed throughout the day, as different groups used public transportation for various purposes. Morning crowds were typically focused and time-conscious. Midday passengers included seniors, parents with children, and people managing medical appointments or government business. Evening runs brought commuters again, but also service workers ending late shifts, students returning from classes, and residents heading to shopping centers or social activities. Bob Martinez had memorized not just the route geography, but also the passenger patterns, traffic timing, and potential hazard points that defined each run. He knew which intersections experienced backing problems during certain weather conditions, which bus stops attracted individuals who might create disturbances, and which areas were prone to accidents or construction delays that could affect scheduling. This level of detailed knowledge wasn't unusual among experienced drivers, but Bob's approach to collecting and organizing information suggested training that went beyond civilian transportation experience. Emma had noticed that Bob's route reports included details that other drivers overlooked, and his passenger incident reports demonstrated observational skills that seemed almost investigative in their precision. The radio communication protocols at Metro Transit followed standard practices developed for coordinating multiple vehicles across complex urban environments. Drivers were expected to report their status at designated checkpoints, request assistance for mechanical problems or passenger issues, and maintain professional communication that could be monitored by supervisory staff and recorded for quality assurance purposes. Bob Martinez followed these protocols exactly, but his radio communication style differed subtly from other drivers. His reports were concise, specific, and delivered with consistent timing that suggested internalized discipline rather than casual compliance. Other drivers sometimes engaged in informal chatter during quiet periods, but Bob limited his transmissions to required information and direct responses to dispatch requests. Emma had begun paying attention to these communication patterns because they reminded her of military radio protocols, where precision and brevity were essential for operational security and efficiency. Civilians sometimes adopted professional communication styles through training or personal preference, but Bob's approach suggested muscle memory developed through extensive practice in high-stakes environments. The depot's social dynamics revolved around informal groups that form around shared interests, work schedules, or personality compatibility. Derek Thompson had assembled a loose coalition of drivers who appreciated his commentary and positioned themselves as the voice of practical experience. James Wilson maintained friendly relationships across different groups without committing to any particular alliance. Sandra Kim focused on administrative responsibilities while maintaining professional courtesy with all personnel. Bob Martinez existed somewhat outside these social structures, not through rejection or conflict, but through a combination of personal preference and others' assumptions about his interests and capabilities. Derek's ongoing commentary had created a perception that Bob was either antisocial or simply uninteresting, which suited Bob's apparent desire to avoid attention and minimize personal disclosure. Emma recognized this dynamic because she'd observed similar situations in military settings, where individuals with specialized backgrounds sometimes maintained low profiles to avoid unwanted scrutiny or assignment to duties they preferred to avoid. The strategy worked as long as circumstances didn't require revealing hidden capabilities, but it also created vulnerabilities if emergency situations demanded immediate access to those capabilities. Part 3 Initial friction. The first real confrontation happened during Bob's second week on the job, though most people forgot about it until much later when context made the details significant. Route 47's afternoon run had been delayed by construction traffic, putting Bob 23 minutes behind schedule when he reached the Central Station transfer point. Approximately 40 passengers were waiting, many checking their watches and showing obvious irritation about the delay. Derek Thompson happened to be dead heading back to the depot in bus 1056 when Bob's delayed arrival created a backup of passengers and vehicles at the station platform. Derek had a clear view of Bob's approach and subsequent passenger loading process, which he later described to anyone who would listen as a master class in how not to handle schedule pressure. Instead of rushing through the passenger boarding process to make up time, Bob maintained his standard procedure of helping elderly passengers with their bags, ensuring wheelchair users were properly secured, and waiting for all passengers to be seated before closing doors and departing. The process took an additional 4 minutes, which Derek calculated as adding even more delay to an already problematic situation. Derek's radio transmission cut through the afternoon chatter with obvious frustration. Dispatch, this is Bus 1056. I'm watching Route 47 at Central Station and we've got a situation developing. Drivers moving like he's got all day while passengers are backing up and connecting routes are getting delayed. Sandra Kim's voice responded immediately, professional but with an edge that suggested she was monitoring multiple problems simultaneously. Boss 1056 maintain radio discipline. Route 47 what's your passenger count and estimated departure time? Bob's response came without any defensive tone or acknowledgement of Derek's criticism. Dispatch Boss 1247 loading 42 passengers, wheelchair secure departure in 90 seconds. Next checkpoint Victoria Street, estimated arrival 1450 hours. Derek couldn't let it pass. 1450, Bob, you're already 25 minutes late. These people have connections to make, jobs to get to. Maybe pick up the pace a little bit. Emma Chen had been monitoring the radio exchange from her position in the dispatch center, taking notes about communication patterns and driver interactions. She noticed that Bob's response maintained consistent professional formatting while Derek's comments became increasingly and critical. This wasn't unusual in high-pressure transportation work, but the dynamic seemed to reveal something about both personalities. Boss 1056 cleared the channel for operational traffic. Sandra interrupted, but Derek's point had been made publicly. Other drivers monitoring the frequency had heard Derek's criticism of Bob's pace, and several later admitted they agreed with Derek's assessment that Bob prioritized excessive caution over schedule efficiency. The incident established a pattern that would repeat dozens of times over the following months. Derek would identify situations where Bob's methodical approach created delays or inefficiencies, broadcast his observations for other drivers to hear, and position himself as the voice of practical experience dealing with real-world transportation challenges. Bob never responded to Derek's criticism directly, never defended his procedures, and never altered his approach based on peer pressure or supervisory suggestions. His passenger boarding process remained identical whether he was running on time, running late, or dealing with difficult circumstances. His driving speed stayed consistent regardless of traffic conditions or schedule pressure. His pre-trip inspections followed the same comprehensive checklist whether he was the first boss out or the last boss returning. Other drivers began noticing these patterns and drawing their own conclusions about Bob's capabilities and priorities. Mike O'Brien started volunteering for routes that Bob typically handled, particularly during busy periods when schedule adherence was critical. James Wilson mentioned to Sandra that Bob might benefit from refresher training about time management during passenger loading. Even drivers who didn't participate in Derek's commentary began viewing Bob as someone who needed accommodation, rather than someone whose methods might serve purposes they didn't understand. The passenger complaints started accumulating gradually, usually focusing on delays rather than safety concerns or service quality. People rushing to make connecting buses or arrive at appointments on time found Bob's careful approach frustrating, especially when they could see that other drivers managed similar routes with better schedule performance. Sandra Kim began receiving feedback from route supervisors about Route 47's on-time statistics, which consistently ranked in the bottom quartile compared to other crosstown services. The complaints weren't about Bob's driving safety, passenger relations, or equipment maintenance, all of which received positive ratings. The issue was purely about speed and efficiency, which made it difficult to address through standard corrective measures. Emma Chen found herself in an awkward position as the newest member of the supervisory team tasked with managing driver performance issues. Her instincts suggested that Bob's approach served purposes that weren't immediately obvious, but she couldn't defend methods that were creating measurable problems for schedule adherence and passenger satisfaction. The situation reached a decision point when Patricia Hayes, the Transit Authority's general manager, requested a meeting about Route 47's performance statistics and passenger feedback trends. Patricia had built her career on data-driven management and customer service excellence, which meant that any route consistently underperforming in measurable categories required administrative attention. Emma prepared for the meeting by reviewing 3 months of operational data, passenger complaints, and driver performance evaluations. The numbers told a clear story about Bob's impact on Route 47's efficiency metrics, but they also revealed some interesting patterns that complicated the narrative Derek Thompson had been promoting. Route 47 under Bob's management had 0 passenger injuries, 0 equipment failures requiring emergency service, 0 incidents requiring police intervention, and 0 complaints about driver behavior or professionalism. Bob's pre-trip inspections had identified mechanical problems that prevented 3 potential breakdowns, and his careful driving had avoided 2 traffic accidents that could have resulted in injuries and service disruptions. Emma realized she was looking at a classic management dilemma, where short-term efficiency metrics conflicted with long-term risk management and safety considerations. Bob's methods produced measurable delays, but they also prevented problems that could create much larger delays and far more serious consequences. The question was whether Metro Transit's management structure could accommodate an employee whose value was primarily preventive rather than productive, and whether Bob's approach represented excessive caution or professional expertise applied to civilian transportation challenges. Derek Thompson had no such ambiguity in his assessment. From his perspective, Bob Martinez was a liability who needed either additional training or reassignment to less demanding duties. Derek had begun building a case for administrative action, collecting examples of delays and passenger complaints that he planned to present as evidence of Bob's unsuitability for high-volume route management. Mike O'Brien supported Derek's position while positioning himself as a solution to the Route 47 efficiency problem. Mike had volunteered to take over several of Bob's runs, and had demonstrated improved schedule performance, which he attributed to more appropriate urgency and passenger handling techniques. James Wilson remained neutral but privately wondered whether Bob might be better suited for routes with less schedule pressure and fewer passenger volume challenges. James didn't participate in Derek's criticism, but he also didn't defend Bob's methods when other drivers raised concerns about Route 47's performance impact on connecting services. Sandra Kim faced pressure from multiple directions as passenger complaints accumulated, schedule performance data became harder to explain, and other drivers began requesting reassignment away from routes that connected with Bob's delays. Sandra appreciated Bob's reliability and safety record, but she also had to manage operational efficiency and customer satisfaction across the entire system. The friction that had started with Derek's public criticism was developing into a broader consensus that Bob Martinez, despite his personal professionalism and safety consciousness, was not well suited for the demands of urban transit operations during peak service periods. Part 4 Collective Rejection. The WhatsApp group called MTA Comedy Central started as a way for night shift drivers to share funny passenger stories and coordinate carpools. But it evolved into something darker during Bob Martinez's 4th month at Metro Transit. Derek Thompson had discovered that humor was an effective way to build consensus around his observations, and Bob's predictably methodical behavior provided endless material for creative interpretation. The first meme appeared on a Tuesday morning after Bob had taken 7 minutes to help an elderly woman with a walker board his bus during rush hour. Someone had taken a photo through the bus window showing Bob carefully positioning the walker and guiding the woman to her seat while a line of passengers waited behind her. The caption read, "Breaking local bus driver discovers new speed setting below turtle mode." Within 30 minutes the image had been shared across 3 different group chats, received 47 reaction emojis, and inspired 6 variations including Bob's face photoshopped onto a sloth hanging from a tree branch. The original photographer Mike O'Brien felt slightly guilty about taking the picture without permission, but the positive response encouraged him to document more examples of Bob's unique approach to passenger service. Derek Thompson recognized an opportunity to formalize his ongoing commentary about Bob's performance into something more persuasive and entertaining. Derek began curating the most compelling examples of Bob's slow-motion driving style, creating a narrative that positioned Bob as well-intentioned but fundamentally unsuited for modern transit operations. Operation Turtle Watch became a running joke among drivers who monitored Route 47's progress and reported particularly egregious examples of schedule deviation. Someone created a mock bingo card with squares for Bob helps passenger for more than 2 minutes. Bob stops at yellow light instead of proceeding. Bob checks mirrors more than 5 times at single intersection, and Bob's boss creates backup of 3 or more vehicles. The humor served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. It provided a socially acceptable way for drivers to express frustration about schedule coordination problems that Bob's delays created for connecting routes. It established group consensus that Bob's methods were problematic without requiring direct confrontation or formal complaints. It positioned Derek Thompson as a leader whose observations reflected widespread professional opinion rather than personal criticism. James Wilson participated reluctantly in some of the conversations, mostly to avoid becoming a target himself, but he increasingly felt uncomfortable with the direction the humor was taking. The jokes were becoming meaner, more personal, and focused on Bob's age and perceived incompetence rather than legitimate operational concerns. Sandra Kim became aware of the group messaging when drivers began referencing inside jokes during official communications. References to Turtle Mode and Operation Turtle Watch appeared in radio chatter and breakroom conversations, creating an atmosphere where Bob's professional reputation was being undermined through collective mockery rather than formal performance evaluation. Emma Chen discovered the WhatsApp group when Mike O'Brien accidentally sent a Bob-related meme to the official dispatch channel instead of the unofficial humor group. Emma immediately understood that she was looking at a systematic campaign of workplace harassment disguised as harmless joking, but she also recognized that addressing it directly might create more problems than it solved. The memes and jokes were spreading beyond Metro Transit employees as drivers shared content with friends and family members who worked in other transportation companies. Phoenix's public transportation community was relatively small, and Bob's reputation as the slowest bus driver in Arizona was becoming known among people who had never actually ridden Route 47 or witnessed his work directly. Tom Garcia, Derek's friend from the maintenance department, contributed technical expertise to the mockery by creating fake performance metrics that supposedly measured Bob's impact on overall system efficiency. Charts showing passenger time lost to Bob Martinez and fuel wasted by excessive stopping looked official enough to be convincing, though they were entirely fictional. The fake data circulated through multiple group chats and eventually reached drivers from other Metro Transit routes who began sharing their own stories about delays caused by Bob's connection points. Soon Bob Martinez was being blamed for schedule problems that had nothing to do with his actual performance, but the narrative was too entertaining and convenient to require fact-checking. Patricia Hayes, the general manager, became aware of the social media activity when her assistant mentioned seeing Metro Transit drivers sharing unprofessional content on public platforms. Patricia requested examples and was disturbed to discover that one of her drivers had become the subject of systematic ridicule that was now representing Metro Transit's internal culture to outside observers. The situation escalated when a local transportation blogger picked up some of the Bob Martinez memes and wrote a piece about public transit's efficiency problem that used Bob as an example of how government-operated transportation services prioritized bureaucratic procedures over customer service. The blog post included several photos from the WhatsApp group and quotes from anonymous Metro Transit employees criticizing Bob's performance. Emma Chen found herself in the impossible position of defending an employee whose work methods she didn't fully understand against criticism that contained elements of truth mixed with unfair exaggeration and cruel humor. Bob's schedule performance was genuinely problematic, but the mockery had evolved far beyond legitimate professional feedback into something that resembled organized harassment. Sandra Kim attempted to address the social media situation by issuing a memo about professional communication standards and social media policies, but the memo was immediately screenshot and added to the WhatsApp groups with commentary about management overreach and political correctness. The attempted intervention had made the problem worse by drawing official attention to behavior that most participants viewed as harmless workplace humor. Bob Martinez remained apparently unaware of his internet fame, or at least he showed no signs of being affected by the mockery. His routine remained identical, his professional demeanor unchanged, and his performance metrics consistent with his previous patterns. If he knew that dozens of his colleagues were sharing photos and jokes about his work, he gave no indication that it bothered him or influenced his behavior. Derek Thompson interpreted Bob's lack of response as evidence that the criticism was justified, and that Bob either agreed with the assessment or lacked the self-awareness to understand how his performance affected others. Derek began arguing that management needed to take action since Bob apparently wasn't capable of self-correction based on peer feedback. Mike O'Brien started volunteering for additional shifts and overtime opportunities, positioning himself as a reliable alternative when Bob's delays created problems for connecting services. Mike's initiative was noticed by supervisory staff, who appreciated having a driver willing to handle difficult situations with appropriate urgency. The collective rejection was becoming institutionalized as drivers, dispatchers, and management personnel all developed expectations about Bob's limitations and began making accommodations that effectively isolated him from opportunities that require schedule reliability or passenger volume management. Bob Martinez was being systematically marginalized within Metro Transit's operational structure, not through official disciplinary action, but through informal consensus that he was unsuitable for normal responsibilities. James Wilson finally reached his limit when someone shared a meme showing Bob's face on the shell of a turtle with the caption "Phoenix Public Transportation, moving at the speed of evolution." James deleted himself from the WhatsApp group and stopped participating in breakroom conversations about Bob's performance, but he didn't speak up to defend Bob either. The social media campaign had achieved Derek Thompson's objective of building consensus that Bob Martinez was a problem requiring management intervention, but it had also created a workplace culture where systematic harassment was acceptable as long as it was framed as humor and focused on performance issues rather than protected characteristics. Emma Chen realized she was witnessing a case study in how workplace bullying could be disguised as professional feedback, and how social media platforms could amplify individual prejudices into collective action that destroyed careers and reputations regardless of actual job performance or personal merit. Part 5 The dissenter emerges. Emma Chen's background in military logistics had taught her to value different types of intelligence and recognized that unusual approaches sometimes served purposes that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. While her colleagues at Metro Transit were increasingly convinced that Bob Martinez was simply too slow and cautious for urban transportation work, Emma began noticing details that suggested a different interpretation of his behavior. The first anomaly Emma identified was Bob's road timing, which showed patterns that contradicted the narrative about his supposed inefficiency. While Bob's overall schedule performance ranked poorly compared to other drivers, his timing between stops was remarkably consistent regardless of traffic conditions, weather or passenger volume. Other drivers showed significant variation in their segment times based on external factors, but Bob maintained steady progress that suggested he was compensating for variables that other drivers allowed to disrupt their schedules. Emma pulled 3 months of GPS tracking data and discovered that Bob's routes showed fewer total stops, fewer speed variations, and more efficient fuel consumption than comparable drivers on similar routes. Bob was somehow managing to maintain steady progress while appearing to move slowly, which suggested that his methods prioritized smooth flow over rapid acceleration and braking. The passenger injury statistics provided another clue that Bob's approach might be more sophisticated than his critics understood. Route 47 under Bob's management had 0 passenger falls, 0 injuries during boarding or departure, and 0 incidents requiring medical attention. Other routes with similar passenger demographics and vehicle types reported regular minor injuries related to sudden stops, rapid acceleration, or passengers losing balance during normal driving maneuvers. Emma realized that Bob's careful passenger boarding procedures and gradual acceleration weren't signs of excessive caution or slow reflexes. They were systematic safety measures that prevented injuries and insurance claims that could cost Metro Transit thousands of dollars per incident. Bob's slowness was actually precision driving that prioritized passenger welfare over speed metrics. The mechanical maintenance records revealed additional evidence that Bob's approach served practical purposes beyond schedule adherence. Bob's 1247 requires significantly fewer repairs than vehicles operating on comparable routes, showed less wear on brakes and transmission components, and had never required emergency roadside service during Bob's shifts. Bob's smooth driving style was extending vehicle life and reducing maintenance costs that weren't captured in simple schedule performance measurements. Emma began paying closer attention to Bob's radio communications and noticed that his reports included information that other drivers typically overlooked. Bob consistently reported traffic conditions, road hazards, and passenger incidents that helped dispatch coordinate responses and warn other drivers about developing problems. His transmissions were brief but informationally dense, suggesting systematic observation skills that went beyond casual awareness. During a particularly busy afternoon when multiple routes experienced delays due to a downtown traffic accident, Emma monitored radio chatter and noticed that Bob was providing real-time updates about alternate routes and traffic flow patterns that demonstrated detailed knowledge of Phoenix Street networks beyond his assigned route. Bob wasn't just driving Route 47, he was maintaining awareness of the entire transportation grid and sharing intelligence that helped other drivers avoid problems. Emma decided to review Bob's employment application and background check information, looking for clues about his previous experience that might explain his unusual competence in areas unrelated to civilian bus driving. The file was surprisingly thin, containing only basic personal information, a clean driving record and employment references from positions that seemed unrelated to transportation work. The references checked out when Emma contacted them, but the responses seemed carefully neutral, providing confirmation of employment dates and basic job performance without offering details about Bob's specific responsibilities or capabilities. Emma recognized this pattern from her military experience, where references for personnel with classified backgrounds often provided minimal information to avoid inadvertent disclosure of sensitive details. Emma's suspicions were confirmed when she noticed that Bob's job application listed a 10-year gap in employment history between his previous civilian work and his hiring at Metro Transit. The application indicated that Bob had been traveling during this period, which was a common euphemism for military service or other government work that couldn't be disclosed publicly. Sarah Kim, the dispatcher, mentioned to Emma that Bob occasionally used military time references and tactical terminology during radio communications, particularly during stressful situations. Sarah hadn't thought much about it since many Metro Transit employees were veterans, but she'd noticed that Bob's military language was more precise and current than typical veterans who had been out of service for years. Emma began observing Bob more carefully during his daily routine, looking for behavioral patterns that might indicate specialized training or experience. Bob's situational awareness was remarkable. He consistently noticed details about passengers' traffic and environmental conditions that other drivers missed. His physical positioning during passenger interactions suggested defensive tactics training, and his vehicle inspection procedures included checks that weren't part of standard Metro Transit protocols. The breakthrough came when Emma witnessed Bob's response to a minor incident involving an agitated passenger who was verbally threatening other riders. While Emma was preparing to dispatch security assistance, Bob had already de-escalated the situation using communication techniques that were clearly professional rather than intuitive. Bob's body language, voice control and positioning during the interaction demonstrated crisis management training that went far beyond customer service guidelines. Emma realized she was looking at someone whose qualifications were dramatically underutilized in his current position, but who had chosen this work for reasons that weren't apparent from his job performance metrics or workplace interactions. Bob Martinez wasn't a slow, overly cautious bus driver. He was a highly trained professional applying military-grade skills to civilian transportation challenges. The question was why someone with Bob's apparent capabilities would choose to work in a position where his skills were unrecognized and his methods were subject to constant criticism. Emma considered several possibilities. Bob might be retired from classified work and seeking quiet civilian employment. He might be dealing with personal issues that made high-stress positions inadvisable, or he might be fulfilling some sense of service obligation by protecting civilian populations in ways they wouldn't understand or appreciate. Emma faced a dilemma about whether to share her observations with other supervisory staff or investigate further before taking action. Bob's performance was still creating legitimate operational problems that affected other drivers and passenger satisfaction, regardless of his underlying qualifications or intentions. Emma's growing respect for Bob's hidden capabilities didn't eliminate the need to address Route 47's schedule performance issues. At the same time, Emma recognized that Bob's methods might be preventing problems that were more serious than schedule delays. If Bob was using professional security skills to identify and neutralize threats that other drivers wouldn't even notice, his value to Metro Transit could be far greater than standard performance metrics indicated. Emma decided to conduct her own informal investigation before involving other management personnel or confronting Bob directly about her suspicions. She began monitoring Bob's routes more closely, reviewing incident reports from other drivers for comparison, and researching public records that might provide clues about Bob's background without violating privacy policies or creating unwanted attention. The investigation would take time, but Emma was convinced that Bob Martinez represented either a significant security asset or a potential liability that Metro Transit needed to understand better. Either way, the collective assumption that Bob was simply an inefficient driver was preventing proper evaluation of his actual capabilities and appropriate utilization of his skills. Emma Chen had become the dissenting voice in Metro Transit consensus about Bob Martinez, but she was also the only person in a position to investigate her suspicions and potentially discover the truth about who Bob really was, and why he had chosen to spend his days driving a city bus through Phoenix traffic while enduring mockery from people who had no idea what they were actually looking at. The Phoenix Transportation Workers Union meeting happened on the third Thursday of every month in a rented conference room at the Desert Inn, and Bob Martinez had never attended one until Derek Thompson made it impossible for him to avoid. Derek had spent weeks building momentum for what he called addressing systemic efficiency problems in Metro Transit operations, and he'd specifically requested that Bob be present to discuss Route 47's performance impact on the overall system. 23 drivers filled the conference room that evening, representing different routes and shifts across Metro Transit network. Derek had positioned himself at the head of the table with a laptop computer and printed charts that he'd prepared specifically for this presentation. The charts looked official, with Metro Transit logos and professional formatting that disguised the fact that most of the data had been selectively edited to support Derek's predetermined conclusions. Bob arrived exactly on time, carrying a small notebook and a cup of coffee in his tinted metal thermos. He took a seat near the back of the room and waited quietly while Derek distributed handouts and adjusted the projection screen. Other drivers greeted each other with the casual familiarity of colleagues who worked overlapping schedules, but Bob received only polite nods and uncomfortable glances from people who knew they were about to witness his professional humiliation. Derek began his presentation with system-wide statistics that showed Metro Transit's on-time performance had declined by 4% over the past 6 months. He attributed this decline primarily to bottleneck effects created by individual routes that consistently ran behind schedule and forced other drivers to adjust their timing to accommodate delayed connections. The first chart showed Route 47's punctuality statistics compared to similar crosstown services, with Bob's performance highlighted in red to emphasize the deviation from acceptable standards. Derek explained that Bob's average delay of 12 minutes per run created cascade effects that impacted 7 other routes and resulted in passenger complaints that reflected poorly on the entire Transit system. Mike O'Brien raised his hand to add his personal experience of dealing with Bob's delays. I've had to hold at Central Station for 15 minutes waiting for Route 47 connections, and passengers get frustrated when they see empty buses sitting there instead of moving. It makes all of us look incompetent when really it's just one driver who can't keep up with the pace. James Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his seat but didn't contradict Mike's assessment. Several other drivers nodded in agreement, and someone muttered about having similar experiences with Route 47's chronic lateness affecting their own schedules. Derek's second chart purported to show the financial impact of Bob's delays, calculating lost productivity over time costs for drivers who had to extend their shifts and fuel waste from buses idling while waiting for delayed connections. The numbers looked impressive and concerning, though Derek had inflated most of them by applying worst-case scenarios and assuming that all schedule variations were directly attributable to Bob's driving methods. Tom Garcia contributed maintenance data that supposedly demonstrated how Bob's excessive driving style was actually increasing wear and tear on bus 1247 through unnecessary brake applications and engine stress from frequent stops. Tom's presentation conveniently omitted the fact that Bus 1247 had the lowest maintenance costs and highest reliability ratings in the fleet, focusing instead on theoretical problems that might develop if Bob's methods were applied more broadly. Sandra Kim attended the meeting as a management representative and found herself in the awkward position of defending an employee whose performance created legitimate operational challenges while also maintaining professional standards for workplace discussions. Sandra tried to redirect the conversation toward constructive solutions rather than personal criticism, but Derek's presentation had created momentum that was difficult to counter with Albert's threat to ridiculous. Derek's most damaging evidence came from passenger feedback surveys that had been selectively edited to emphasize complaints about Route 47 schedule reliability while omitting positive comments about driver courtesy, safety, and helpfulness. Derek read several quotes from passengers who had missed appointments or connections due to late buses, creating an emotional impact that statistics alone couldn't achieve. This isn't about personal attacks, Derek explained, looking directly at Bob while addressing the group. This is about professional responsibility to our passengers and our colleagues. When one driver's methods create problems for everyone else, we have to address it collectively because management obviously isn't taking action on their own. Bob listened to the entire presentation without interruption, taking occasional notes in his small notebook but showing no visible reaction to the criticism or the hostile alert frustrations or the hostations and created. When Derek finished and asked if anyone had questions or comments, Bob remained silent while other drivers offered additional examples of problems they attribute to Route 47's performance. The union representative Patricia Valdez attempted to moderate the discussion by reminding everyone that performance issues should be addressed through official channels rather than group confrontation. But several drivers argued that they'd already tried working through management without seeing improvements in Bob's schedule adherence. Derek concluded his presentation by proposing that the union formally request Bob's reassignment to routes with less demanding schedules, or his involvement in additional training programs, studying in programmed motor training, programmed mobile and peritoneum, and the proposal received verbal support from most drivers present, creating official pressure for management action beyond what individual complaints had achieved. Bob was invited to respond to the presentation and the reassignment proposal, but he declined to make any statement beyond thanking everyone for their time and expressing his continued commitment to passenger safety and service quality. His brief response was interpreted by most attendees as confirmation that he understood the criticism was justified but lacked solutions to offer. The meeting ended with Derek's proposal being forwarded to Metro Transit management,
as an official union recommendation supported by detailed documentation and endorsed by a substantial majority of drivers who were routes that connected with Bob's schedule.
Sandra Kim left the meeting knowing she would have to schedule a formal performance review and develop responses to union concerns that now carried the weight of collective action. Emma Chen learned about the union meeting from Sandra the following morning, and requested copies of Derek's presentation materials for her own review. Emma immediately recognized that the charts and statistics had been manipulated to support predetermined conclusions, but she also understood that the political momentum Derek had created would be difficult to counter with technical corrections or alternate interpretations of the same data. The union meeting had achieved Derek's objective of transforming individual complaints about Bob's performance into collective action that demanded management response. Bob was no longer just a slow driver who frustrated some colleagues. He was now officially recognized as a systemic problem requiring institutional intervention. Word of the union meeting spread quickly through Metro Transit's informal communication networks, reaching drivers who hadn't attended but who began paying closer attention to Route 47's impact on their own schedules. The meeting had legitimized criticism of Bob's methods and created social pressure for him to either change his approach or accept reassignment to less demanding duties. Bob's isolation within Metro Transit's social structure became more pronounced as drivers who had previously maintained neutral relationships began treating him as someone whose professional future was uncertain. Conversation stopped when Bob entered break areas and his request for schedule adjustments or maintenance support received less cooperative responses from colleagues who viewed him as a liability rather than a team member. Derek Thompson's campaign had succeeded in creating conditions where Bob Martinez was systematically excluded from normal workplace relationships and professional opportunities, effectively forcing him to either conform to expectations that contradicted his training and instincts or accept marginalization within the transit system he was trying to serve. The humiliation was complete when someone posted photos from the union meeting to the WhatsApp group, showing Bob sitting alone at the back of the room while Derek presented charts documenting his professional failures. The images were accompanied by captions about accountability and facing reality. But the underlying message was clear: Bob Martinez had been formally rejected by his professional community and was now subject to institutional pressure that would determine his future at Metro Transit. Part 7 The Anomaly Discovery. Emma Chen's systematic investigation of Bob Martinez began with a detailed analysis of incident reports across Metro Transit's entire fleet, looking for patterns that might reveal whether Bob's cautious driving style actually prevented problems that other drivers experienced more frequently. What she discovered challenged every assumption that Derek Thompson's campaign had promoted about Bob's supposed incompetence. Over the previous 12 months, Bob had filed 17 incident reports documenting suspicious behavior, potential security threats and unusual circumstances that he'd observed during his routes. Other drivers averaged 3 such reports per year, and most focused on routine passenger disturbances or minor traffic accidents. Bob's reports described observations that suggested systematic surveillance of transportation infrastructure, coordinated activities by individuals who appeared to be conducting reconnaissance, and communication patterns among passengers that indicated possible planning for disruptive activities. Emma cross-referenced Bob's incident reports with police intelligence bulletins and federal security advisories, discovering that several of Bob's observations had been independently verified through other sources and contributed to investigations of potential terrorities in the Phoenix metropolitan area. Bob wasn't filing excessive paperwork due to paranoia or overcautiousness. He was providing legitimate intelligence about security threats that other drivers either didn't notice or didn't recognize as significant. The most compelling evidence came from Bob's report dated 6 weeks earlier, describing 3 individuals who had ridden Route 47 on separate occasions while taking photographs of bridge structures, tunnel entrances and government buildings along the route. Bob had documented their behavior in detail, including descriptions of their clothing, equipment, and conversation topics that suggested they were gathering information for purposes unrelated to tourism or casual interest. Emma contacted the Phoenix Police Department's Intelligence Division and learned that Bob's report had been forwarded to federal authorities who were investigating potential threats to transportation infrastructure in southwestern cities. The investigation was ongoing, but Bob's observations had provided valuable information about reconnaissance activities that fit patterns associated with domestic terrorist organizations. Additional research revealed that Bob's route modifications, which Derek Thompson had criticized as evidence of poor time management, were actually tactical adjustments designed to vary his schedule and path in ways that made surveillance or attack planning more difficult. Bob wasn't driving slowly because he lacked confidence or competence. He was implementing counter-surveillance measures that protected both his passengers and the transportation infrastructure he was responsible for monitoring. Emma discovered that Bob's careful passenger boarding procedures included systematic observation techniques that allowed him to identify individuals who might pose security risks or who were displaying behavioral indicators associated with potential threats. Bob's excessive attention to passenger interactions was actually professional screening that other drivers weren't trained to recognize or perform. The maintenance records provided additional evidence that Bob's driving methods served security purposes beyond simple passenger safety. Bob's routes included regular variations in timing and path selection that made his bus difficult to track or predict, which explained why his schedule performance appeared inconsistent when measured against standard efficiency metrics. Bob was prioritizing operational security over schedule adherence, following protocols that civilian transportation systems typically didn't consider necessary. Emma's breakthrough came when she noticed that Bob's radio communications included coded references that weren't part of standard metro transit procedures. Bob occasionally used phrases like condition yellow and all clear that suggested he was reporting security status information to someone outside the normal dispatch system. Emma began monitoring Bob's transmissions more carefully and realized he was providing regular updates about potential threats and suspicious activities using terminology that wouldn't be recognized by casual listeners. The discovery led Emma to investigate whether Bob was operating under some form of official security assignment that Metro Transit Management wasn't aware of or wasn't authorized to know about. Emma's military background included familiarity with interagency operations where personnel from different organizations worked together on classified projects without full disclosure to their primary employers. Emma requested a private meeting with Patricia Hayes, Metro Transit's general manager, to discuss her findings about Bob's activities and their potential implications for system security. Patricia initially assumed Emma was preparing to support Derek Thompson's complaints about Bob's performance, but Emma's presentation of security-related evidence created an entirely different context for understanding Bob's behavior. Patricia had received several commendations from federal agencies for Metro Transit's cooperation with security initiatives, but she hadn't been informed about specific personnel who might be contributing to those efforts. Patricia realized that Bob Martinez might be operating under agreements or assignments that were above her clearance level or outside her need-to-know authorization. Emma's investigation revealed that Bob's employment at Metro Transit had been facilitated through a federal program that placed qualified security personnel in civilian positions where they could monitor potential threats to critical infrastructure. The program was classified, which explained why Bob's background check had been minimal, and why his references had provided only basic confirmation of his eligibility for employment. The program's existence explained why Bob's methods seemed to contradict standard transportation efficiency practices while serving purposes that weren't immediately obvious to civilian management. Bob wasn't just a bus driver who happened to have military experience, he was an active security asset whose primary mission was threat detection and intelligence gathering rather than schedule adherence or passenger service optimization. Emma realized that Derek Thompson's campaign to remove Bob from Route 47 could potentially compromise an ongoing federal security operation and expose critical infrastructure to increased risk from the very threats that Bob was positioned to identify and report. The union's proposal to reassign Bob to less demanding routes would eliminate his access to the strategic locations and passenger populations that made his position valuable for intelligence purposes. The situation created a complex management challenge where Emma needed to protect Bob's security mission without revealing classified information to unauthorized personnel or compromising operational security through inappropriate disclosure. Emma also needed to address legitimate operational concerns about Route 47 schedule performance without undermining Bob's ability to perform his actual primary duties. Emma scheduled a secure communication session with federal contacts from her military service to verify her suspicions about Bob's assignment and determine what information she was authorized to share with Metro Transit management. The conversation confirmed that Bob Martinez was indeed operating under federal authority, and that his work at Metro Transit served national security purposes that took precedence over normal employment considerations. Emma was authorized to take whatever administrative actions were necessary to protect Bob's position and mission, but she was also instructed to maintain operational security by avoiding disclosure of specific details about Bob's activities or the nature of the threats he was monitoring. Emma would have to defend Bob against Derek Thompson's criticism without explaining why Bob's methods were actually appropriate for his real responsibilities. The federal contact also informed Emma that intelligence agencies had been monitoring the social media campaign against Bob with concern. Recognizing that systematic harassment of undercover security personnel could compromise operations and create vulnerabilities that hostile organizations might exploit, Emma's investigation had accidentally uncovered evidence that Derek Thompson's seemingly innocent workplace criticism was potentially undermining national security operations. Emma faced the realization that her next actions would determine whether Bob Martinez could continue his security mission, or whether Derek Thompson's campaign would succeed in removing a federal asset from a position where he was providing critical intelligence about potential terrorist activities targeting Phoenix's transportation infrastructure. Part 8 Investigation Phase. Emma Chen's discovery that Bob Martinez might be operating under federal security authority created an urgent need for verification and coordination with agencies that could either confirm or deny her suspicions without compromising ongoing operations. Emma's military background included protocols for interagency communication, but she hadn't used those channels since transitioning to civilian employment, and she wasn't certain whether her previous clearances remained active or applicable to her current situation. The first step required Emma to establish secure communication with federal contacts who could verify Bob's status without triggering security alerts or creating records that might compromise operational security. Emma used her personal laptop from her apartment to access encrypted communication platforms that she'd maintained from her military service, hoping that her previous credentials would still allow her to request information through unofficial channels. The response came within 6 hours, confirming that Robert Martinez was indeed operating under federal authority, and that his assignment at Metro Transit served classified security purposes related to infrastructure protection and threat assessment. Emma was instructed to maintain Bob's cover and operational security while taking whatever administrative actions were necessary to prevent his removal from Route 47. Emma learned that Bob's mission involved monitoring potential terrorist reconnaissance activities along transportation corridors that connected Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport with downtown government facilities and military installations in the surrounding area. Route 47's path provided access to strategic locations that made it valuable for both intelligence gathering and threat detection, which explained why Bob's seemingly inefficient driving methods were actually systematic surveillance techniques. The federal contact informed Emma that intelligence agencies had identified increased chatter and activity among domestic terrorist organizations that were focused on disrupting transportation infrastructure in southwestern cities. Bob's position at Metro Transit provided cover for monitoring these threats while maintaining plausible civilian employment that wouldn't attract attention from hostile surveillance. Emma was authorized to receive additional classified briefings about the specific threats that Bob was monitoring, but only if she agreed to accept temporary reactivation of her military security clearance and formal assignment as a federal liaison within Metro Transit's management structure. The arrangement would provide Emma with authority to protect Bob's mission while maintaining operational security protocols. The briefing revealed that federal agencies had been tracking a network of individuals associated with a group calling itself the Desert Liberation Front, which had been conducting reconnaissance activities along transportation routes in Phoenix, Tucson, and Albuquerque. The group's communications indicated planning for coordinated attacks on bridges, tunnels, and transit facilities that could cause mass casualties while disrupting regional economic activity. Bob's incident reports had provided crucial intelligence about the group's reconnaissance activities, including photographs, license plate numbers, and behavioral observations that had helped federal investigators identify key personnel and understand the group's operational methods. Bob's apparent overcautiousness about passenger screening and route security was actually professional counter-surveillance that had prevented the group from gathering detailed intelligence about Metro Transit's vulnerabilities. Emma learned that the Desert Liberation Front had specifically targeted Route 47 for reconnaissance because it provided access to multiple strategic locations while serving diverse passenger populations that could mask surveillance activities. The group's operatives had been riding Bob's boss regularly while documenting security procedures, passenger patterns, and potential targets for future attacks. Bob's systematic variations in timing and route selection had disrupted the group's intelligence gathering by making it difficult to predict boss locations or establish patterns that could be exploited for attack planning. Bob's careful passenger screening had also identified several suspected operatives and provided federal agencies with surveillance opportunities that had advanced the overall investigation. The federal briefing included intelligence suggesting that the Desert Liberation Front was accelerating its timeline for operational activities, with communications indicating possible attacks within the next several weeks. Bob's continued presence on Route 47 was considered essential for maintaining surveillance capabilities and providing early warning if the group moved from reconnaissance to active targeting of transportation infrastructure. Emma realized that Derek Thompson's campaign to remove Bob from Route 47 could potentially eliminate federal law enforcement's primary intelligence source about terrorist activities at a critical time when threat levels were increasing. The union's proposal to reassign Bob would not only compromise an ongoing investigation but could also leave Phoenix's transportation system vulnerable to attacks that Bob was uniquely positioned to detect and report. Emma needed to develop a strategy for protecting Bob's position without revealing classified information to Metro Transit personnel who lacked appropriate security clearances. Emma also needed to address legitimate operational concerns with 47 schedule performance while ensuring that Bob could continue his security mission without compromising cover or operational effectiveness. The federal contact provided Emma with guidance about balancing security requirements with normal management responsibilities, including techniques for defending Bob's employment without disclosing specific details about his activities or the nature of the threats he was monitoring. Emma was authorized to use her management authority to override union recommendations and prevent Bob's reassignment, but she needed to provide plausible civilian justifications for her decisions. Emma began developing documentation that would support Bob's continued employment while addressing Derek Thompson's complaints through alternative explanations that didn't reference security considerations. Emma planned to argue that Bob's methods served legitimate safety and customer service purposes that outweighed concern about schedule efficiency, using Bob's excellent safety record and passenger injury statistics to justify his continued assignment to Route 47. The investigation phase also required Emma to assess whether other Metro Transit personnel might be compromised by hostile surveillance or whether Derek Thompson's campaign against Bob had attracted unwanted attention from the Desert Liberation Front or other potential threats. Emma needed to determine whether the systematic harassment of Bob was coincidental workplace conflict or whether it had been influenced by external actors who recognized Bob as an obstacle to their operational planning. Emma's federal contacts provided her with surveillance detection training and communication protocols that would allow her to monitor potential threats to Metro Transit personnel while maintaining her civilian management responsibilities. Emma learned that federal agencies were already conducting background investigations of Metro Transit employees who had access to security-sensitive information or who worked routes that served strategic locations. The investigation revealed that Derek Thompson had been approached by individuals claiming to be transportation efficiency consultants who had offered to provide data analysis and performance metrics that could support his campaign against Bob Martinez. Emma recognized this as a potential attempt by hostile actors to manipulate internal Metro Transit conflict in ways that would benefit their operational objectives. Emma realized that her investigation had uncovered not just Bob's classified security mission, but also evidence that the Desert Liberation Front might be actively working to compromise Metro Transit security by encouraging the removal of personnel who pose threats to their reconnaissance and attack planning activities. The investigation phase concluded with Emma receiving formal authority to coordinate with federal agencies while maintaining her civilian management position, providing her with the resources and clearance necessary to protect Bob's mission while addressing the complex management challenges that Derek Thompson's campaign had created within Metro Transit's organizational structure. Part 9. The breakthrough moment. Emma Chen's secure communication session with federal authorities on a Thursday evening provided the final pieces of intelligence that transformed her suspicions about Bob Martinez into actionable knowledge about an imminent terrorist threat. The classified briefing revealed that the Desert Liberation Front had moved from reconnaissance to active planning phases, with intercepted communications indicating that coordinated attacks on Phoenix Transportation were scheduled to occur within 72 hours. The intelligence package included surveillance photographs showing Desert Liberation Front operatives conducting final reconnaissance along Route 47's path, focusing specifically on the I-10 bridge crossing over the Salt River where afternoon traffic created maximum vulnerability for mass casualty attacks. Federal agencies had identified the bridge as the primary target based on the group's communications and logistical preparations, which included acquisition of explosives and stolen vehicles that could be used for coordinated strikes. Emma learned that Bob Martinez had been providing real-time intelligence about the group's final preparations without realizing that federal agencies were using his reports to track the accelerating timeline toward operational deployment. Bob's incident reports from the previous week had documented increased surveillance activities and behavioral changes among suspected operatives that indicated imminent action rather than continued planning. The federal briefing included specific threat information that made Emma realize why Bob's security mission was so critical to preventing catastrophic attacks. The Desert Liberation Front had planned to use stolen delivery trucks loaded with explosives to simultaneously target bridge support structures during afternoon rush hour traffic, when maximum casualties could be achieved and regional transportation networks could be disrupted for extended periods. Bob's position on Route 47 provided federal agencies with their only reliable intelligence source about the group's final preparations and timing, since other surveillance methods had been compromised by the group's counter-surveillance measures and operational security protocols. Bob's continued presence on the route was essential for providing early warning when the group moved from planning to execution phases. Emma received authorization to implement emergency security protocols within Metro Transit that would protect Bob's mission while preparing for potential terrorist attacks without creating panic or compromising operational security. Emma was instructed to coordinate with Phoenix Police Department tactical units and federal response teams that were positioning assets around potential target areas. The breakthrough moment came when Emma realized that Derek Thompson's campaign to remove Bob from Route 47 was scheduled to culminate in a formal management meeting on Monday morning, exactly when intelligence indicated the Desert Liberation Front planned to execute their attacks. Emma understood that Bob's removal from his route could eliminate federal warning capabilities at the precise moment when his intelligence would be most critical for preventing mass casualties. Emma contacted her federal liaison to report the timing conflict and request guidance about whether the management meeting should be postponed or whether alternative arrangements could be made to protect Bob's position without compromising security protocols. The response was immediate and unambiguous. Bob Martinez must remain on Route 47 regardless of internal Metro Transit politics or management decisions. Emma was authorized to use whatever administrative authority was necessary to override union recommendations and prevent Bob's reassignment, including disclosure of classified information to Patricia Hayes if civilian management cooperation couldn't be secured through other means. Emma was also provided with emergency contact procedures that would allow direct federal intervention if Metro Transit critical security operations. The federal briefing included tactical information about the Desert Liberation Front's operational methods and timeline that helped Emma understand why Bob's specific route and schedule were so important for threat detection. The group had planned their attacks around predictable traffic patterns and transportation schedules, making Bob's systematic route variations and timing modifications critical for disrupting their operational planning. Emma learned that Bob's seemingly excessive passenger screening procedures had actually identified multiple Desert Liberation Front operatives and provided federal agencies with surveillance opportunities that had advanced the investigation to its current stage. Bob's professional security skills had prevented the group from gathering detailed intelligence about Metro Transit vulnerabilities, while simultaneously providing law enforcement with actionable information about the group's membership and activities. The intelligence package included evidence that the Desert Liberation Front had attempted to accelerate Derek Thompson's campaign against Bob by providing manipulated data and performance analysis that supported arguments for Bob's removal from Route 47. Emma realized that the union meeting and formal complaints about Bob's performance had been influenced by hostile actors who recognized Bob as an obstacle to their operational objectives. Emma received training materials and communication protocols that would allow her to coordinate with federal response teams during potential terrorist attacks, while maintaining her civilian management responsibilities. Emma learned that Bob had been equipped with secure communication devices that would allow him to provide real-time intelligence during crisis situations, but that his primary value was preventive rather than reactive. The federal contact informant that intelligence agencies had decided to accelerate their own operational timeline in response to the Desert Liberation Front's imminent attack, with coordinated arrests and interdiction activities planned for Sunday evening to prevent Monday's scheduled attacks. Bob's continued presence on Route 47 would be essential for confirming that the group's leadership had been successfully neutralized and that residual threats had been eliminated. Emma understood that her next actions would determine whether federal law enforcement could prevent terrorist attacks that could kill hundreds of people and disrupt regional transportation networks for months. Emma also realized that Bob Martinez had been operating under extraordinary pressure while enduring systematic flies and maintaining his security mission while protecting his cover identity from colleagues who viewed him as professionally incompetent. The breakthrough moment concluded with Emma receiving formal authority to coordinate emergency response protocols within Metro Transit while maintaining operational security about Bob's classified mission. Emma was authorized to implement whatever administrative measures were necessary to ensure Bob's continued assignment to Route 47, including routine union recommendations and civilian management decisions that could compromise federal security operations. Emma realized that Monday morning would bring either successful prevention of terrorist attacks through coordinated federal action or catastrophic failure if the Desert Liberation Front's operation time proceeded faster than intelligence anticipated. Either way, Bob Martinez would be at the center of events that would determine whether Phoenix's transportation infrastructure survived intact or became the target of the most devastating terrorist attack in southwestern United States history.
Captain Lisa Rodriguez of the Metro Transit Police had been monitoring federal intelligence briefings about transportation security threats for 3 months. But she'd never expected to receive a direct call from Homeland Security at 6:30 a.m. on a Monday morning requesting immediate coordination with civilian personnel who might be operating under classified authority. The call came while Lisa was reviewing overnight incident reports, and the urgency in the federal agent's voice made it clear that routine bureaucratic procedures were being suspended in favor of emergency protocols. The agent identified himself as Special Agent Marcus Webb from the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and explained that Metro Transit might have personnel operating under federal security assignments who required immediate protection and coordination. Agent Webb couldn't provide specific names or details over unsecured communication channels, but he requested that Captain Rodriguez identify any employees whose recent performance reviews or workplace situations might indicate they were serving dual roles beyond their civilian transportation duties. Lisa immediately thought of the ongoing controversy surrounding Bob Martinez and Route 47, not because she suspected Bob of any security connections,
but because Derek Thompson had been pressuring Metro Transit management to take disciplinary action against Bob for several weeks. Lisa had been monitoring the situation because workplace harassment complaints sometimes escalated into incidents requiring police intervention, and Derek's systematic campaign against Bob had created tensions that could potentially disrupt normal operations. Agent Webb's request for information about employees facing workplace pressure or potential reassignment triggered Lisa's professional instincts about the Bob Martinez situation. Lisa had never considered that Bob might have a security background, but Agent Webb's questions suggested that federal agencies were concerned about protecting someone within Metro Transit system who was serving purposes beyond normal civilian employment. Lisa requested a secure meeting with Agent Webb to discuss specific personnel situations that might be relevant to federal security interests. The meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. at Metro Transit headquarters, with participation limited to essential personnel who could be cleared for classified information on an emergency basis. Lisa understood that she was being drawn into an operation that existed at the intersection of civilian law enforcement and federal security agencies. Agent Webb arrived with a team of 3 federal investigators and immediately established secure communication protocols within Metro Transit's administrative complex. The federal team had authorization to access employee records, communication systems and operational data that might be relevant to ongoing security investigations, but they also emphasized that operational security required careful control of information sharing even among authorized personnel. The briefing revealed that federal agencies had been monitoring potential terrorist activities targeting Phoenix transportation infrastructure for several months, with specific focus on coordinated attacks that could cause mass casualties while disrupting regional economic activity. Agent Webb explained that the investigation had reached a critical phase where immediate action was required to prevent attacks that intelligence indicated were planned for that afternoon. Lisa learned that the terrorist organization known as the Desert Liberation Front had been conducting reconnaissance activities along multiple transportation routes, with particular attention to bridge structures and transit facilities that served strategic government and military installations. The group's communication suggested that they had completed planning phases and were moving toward operational deployment of explosive devices during afternoon rush hour traffic. Agent Webb informed Lisa that federal agencies had reason to believe that Metro Transit employed personnel who were serving dual roles as transportation workers and security assets, providing intelligence and threat assessment capabilities that were essential for preventing terrorist attacks. The federal team needed to coordinate with these individuals immediately while maintaining operational security that protected both their missions and their civilian cover identities. Lisa realized that the federal investigation directly related to the Bob Martinez situation when Agent Webb requested specific information about Route 47's operational status, driver assignments, and any recent changes in personnel or scheduling that might affect intelligence gathering capabilities along that particular corridor. Lisa understood that Bob Martinez was almost certainly the security asset that federal agencies were concerned about protecting. The coordination meeting expanded to include Emma Chen, who arrived with detailed documentation about Bob's employment history, performance evaluations and the workplace conflicts that Derek Thompson had been promoting through union channels and social media campaigns. Emma's presentation made it clear that she had been conducting her own investigation of Bob's background and had reached conclusions that aligned with federal security interests. Agent Webb confirmed that Robert Martinez was indeed operating under federal authority, and that his assignment at Metro Transit served classified purposes related to infrastructure protection and terrorist threat assessment. Bob's position on Route 47 provided critical intelligence gathering capabilities that had contributed significantly to the investigation of the Desert Liberation Front and the prevention of multiple potential attacks over the previous months. Lisa learned that Bob's incident reports and observational data had provided federal agencies with actionable intelligence about terrorist reconnaissance activities, operational planning and personnel identification that had advanced the investigation to its current stage. Bob's systematic documentation of suspicious behavior and security anomalies had created an intelligence database that was essential for understanding the Desert Liberation Front's capabilities and intentions. The federal briefing included evidence that the Desert Liberation Front had identified Bob Martinez as a potential obstacle to their operational objectives and had been working to influence Metro Transit personnel decisions in ways that would result in Bob's removal for Route 47. Derek Thompson's campaign against Bob had been amplified by external manipulation that served terrorist interests rather than legitimate workplace concerns. Agent Webb explained that federal agencies had accelerated their operational timeline in response to intelligence indicating that terrorist attacks were imminent, with coordinated strikes planned for multiple transportation targets during afternoon rush hour, when maximum casualties could be achieved. Bob's continued presence on Route 47 was essential for providing real-time intelligence during the critical period when attacks might be attempted. Lisa received authorization to implement emergency security protocols within Metro Transit that would protect federal operations while maintaining normal civilian transportation services. Lisa was instructed to coordinate with Phoenix Police Department tactical units and federal response teams that were positioning assets around potential target areas without creating public awareness that could compromise operational security. The coordination meeting concluded with Agent Webb requesting that Captain Rodriguez assume direct authority over Bob Martinez's security and operational support, ensuring that civilian management decisions didn't interfere with federal security missions during the critical period when terrorist threats were most likely to materialize. Lisa was authorized to override union recommendations and administrative procedures that could compromise Bob's position or mission effectiveness. Lisa understood that her next actions would determine whether federal law enforcement could maintain the intelligence capabilities necessary to prevent terrorist attacks that could devastate Phoenix's transportation infrastructure and cause hundreds of casualties. Lisa also realized that Bob Martinez had been operating under extraordinary circumstances while enduring systematic workplace harassment that was potentially influenced by the very terrorist organization he was helping to investigate. Captain Rodriguez left the coordination meeting with clear understanding that Metro Transit was about to become the focal point of federal counter-terrorism operations, and that her primary responsibility was ensuring that Bob Martinez could continue his security mission regardless of civilian workplace politics or administrative pressures that might compromise national security interests. Part 11, The Confrontation. The white delivery truck appeared on Emma Chen's dispatch monitors at 2:43 p.m., moving westbound on Interstate 10 at speeds that immediately drew attention from automated traffic management systems. The vehicle was weaving between lanes without signaling, forcing other drivers onto shoulders and creating dangerous conditions that triggered multiple calls to Phoenix Police Department traffic enforcement units. Emma was monitoring routine afternoon communications when Bob Martinez's voice cut through the radio chatter with a transmission that changed everything. Dispatch bus 1247. I have visual confirmation on hostile vehicle, white panel trucker Arizona license 749 Charlie Delta Mike. Approaching I-10 bridge structure from northeast approach. Vehicle profile matches intelligence indicators for explosive payload delivery. Recommend immediate tactical response and evacuation protocols for Sector 7 through 12. Emma's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips as Bob's transmission continued with precise tactical language that conferred every suspicion she'd developed about his background and mission. Vehicle occupants appear to be wearing tactical gear consistent with assault preparation. Driver is maintaining communications with external parties via handheld radio. Estimated time to target structure is 4 minutes 30 seconds based on current speed and trajectory. Sandra Kim, who was monitoring the main dispatch channel, stared at her radio equipment like it had malfunctioned. Bob Martinez, the same driver who usually reported minor traffic delays and passenger assistance requests, was providing military-grade threat assessment using terminology that suggested professional training in counter-terrorism operations. Sandra reached for the emergency protocol manual, while Emma activated secure communication channels that connected directly to federal response teams. Bob's next transmission eliminated any remaining doubt about his true capabilities and mission. Dispatch, be advised that I am initiating counter-surveillance maneuvers and moving to intercept position. My current passenger load is 23 civilians including 4 elderly and 2 minors. Requesting priority routing for emergency evacuation while maintaining tactical advantage over hostile vehicle. Emma realized that Bob wasn't just reporting a potential terrorist attack, he was actively engaging the threat using skills and authority that existed far beyond civilian bus driver responsibilities. Emma activated emergency protocols that she'd learned during her federal security briefing, opening communication channels to Agent Webb's tactical team, while coordinating with Captain Rodriguez's transit police units. The I-10 bridge over the Salt River carried approximately 15,000 vehicles during afternoon rush hour, creating a target-rich environment where explosive attacks could cause mass casualties while disrupting regional transportation networks for extended periods. Bob's position on Route 47 had placed him in direct observation of the terrorist approach route at the exact moment when intelligence had predicted attacks would commence. Bob's tactical communications continued as he maneuvered Bus 1247 into a position that would allow him to monitor the delivery truck's movements while protecting his passengers from potential blast effects. Dispatch: hostile vehicle has reduced speed and is positioning for approach to target structure. I count 2 occupants, both wearing tactical gear. Vehicle appears heavily loaded based on suspension characteristics and acceleration patterns. Emma contacted Agent Webb's tactical team using secure communication protocols, providing real-time updates from Bob's observations while coordinating federal response with local law enforcement units that were converging on the I-10 corridor. Agent Webb's response confirmed that federal agencies had been tracking the delivery truck since morning, and that Bob's intelligence was providing critical verification of terrorist attack timeline and methodology. The confrontation escalated when Bob reported that the delivery truck had stopped near the bridge's support structure, and that occupants were beginning to unload equipment that appeared consistent with explosive device placement. Bob's transmission included precise location coordinates and technical descriptions that indicated he was conducting professional battlefield assessment rather than civilian observation. Dispatch: hostile personnel have deployed explosive materials near primary support column, east side of bridge structure. Estimate 3 minutes for device placement and arming sequence. Recommend immediate bridge closure and emergency vehicle deployment. I am moving to secondary observation position while maintaining passenger safety protocols. Emma realized that Bob was simultaneously protecting 23 civilian passengers while conducting tactical reconnaissance of terrorist operations, using his bus as both a mobile observation platform and a protective barrier between potential explosion effects and civilian traffic. Emma coordinated with federal tactical teams to ensure that emergency response didn't interfere with Bob's operations or compromise his position. Agent Webb's tactical team confirmed that federal response units were approaching the target area, but would require several minutes to establish perimeter control and neutralize the terrorist threat. Bob's real-time intelligence was providing critical information about terrorist activities and timing that allowed federal agents to coordinate their approach for maximum effectiveness while minimizing risks to civilian populations. Bob's next communication revealed the full extent of his tactical capabilities and the critical nature of his mission. Dispatch: I have clear sight lines to hostile operations and am prepared to provide suppressing fire if federal units require tactical support. My passengers are secured in protective positions and I have established defensive perimeter around vehicle. Emma understood that Bob Martinez was prepared to engage armed terrorists using weapons and tactics that existed far beyond civilian law enforcement capabilities while simultaneously protecting bus passengers and coordinating with federal response teams. Bob wasn't just a security asset providing intelligence, he was an active counter-terrorism operative capable of direct intervention against hostile forces. The delivery truck's occupants had completed placement of explosive devices and were beginning arming sequences when federal tactical teams established visual contact and prepared to neutralize the threat. Bob's position provided overwatch capabilities that allowed him to monitor terrorist activities while ensuring that federal agents had complete situational awareness during their approach and engagement phases. Bob's final transmission before federal agents engaged the terrorists demonstrated the precision and professionalism that he'd been applying to civilian transportation work for 3 years while maintaining readiness for exactly this type of crisis situation. Federal units: this is Vector 12. I have maintained continuous observation of hostile activities and can confer to active personnel with explosive devices arbiter for maximum structural damage. Civilians are clear of immediate blast radius and I am prepared to provide covering fire for your advance. Emma realized that Bob Martinez had revealed his true identity and capabilities at the moment when civilian and federal authorities needed his expertise most desperately. The quiet bus driver who had endured months of workplace mockery and systematic harassment was actually a highly trained federal agent whose mission had been preventing exactly the type of terrorist attack that was now unfolding in real time. The confrontation concluded with federal tactical teams successfully neutralizing both terrorists and disarming explosive devices that would have stayed in breach and killed hundreds of civilians during afternoon rush hour traffic. Bob's intelligence and tactical support had been essential for preventing what could have been the most devastating terrorist attack in Phoenix history. Captain Rodriguez arrived at Bob's position as federal agents secured the scene, finding Bob Martinez calmly helping elderly passengers off his bus while maintaining radio communication with tactical teams conducting post-incident security sweeps. The transformation from underestimated bus driver to revealed federal agent was complete, but Bob's first priority remained the safety and comfort of the civilian passengers whose lives he had protected. Part 12. The public reckoning. The Metro Transit Authority depot fell silent when Patricia Hayes, the general manager, called an emergency all-hands meeting at 4:30 p.m. just 2 hours after federal tactical teams had prevented terrorist attacks on the I-10 bridge. Every driver, dispatcher and maintenance worker who wasn't handling essential operations gathered in the main assembly area knowing that something extraordinary had occurred but uncertain about the details or implications for their workplace. Derek Thompson arrived expecting to finally receive management support for his campaign against Bob Martinez since the union's formal complaint about Route 47's performance issues was scheduled for administrative review. Derek had prepared additional documentation about Bob's schedule delays and passenger complaints, assuming that the emergency meeting would address personnel decisions that had been delayed by bureaucratic procedures. Emma Chen stood beside Patricia Hayes with a folder containing federal security documents and coordination agreements that would fundamentally change how Metro Transit operated and how its employees understood their role in regional security operations. Emma had been authorized to disclose classified information to Metro Transit personnel on a need-to-know basis, but the revelations would challenge every assumption that drivers and staff had developed about their workplace and colleagues. Patricia began the meeting by acknowledging that Metro Transit had been involved in federal security operations that required cooperation with law enforcement and intelligence agencies, but that operational security had prevented full disclosure to employees who weren't directly involved in those activities. Patricia explained that the afternoon's events had necessitated revealing information that had previously been classified to protect ongoing investigations. Sandra Kim, who had monitored Bob's tactical communications during the crisis, sat near the front of the assembly area with the expression of stunned recognition. Sandra had finally understood why Bob's radio transmissions had always seemed more precise and professional than typical civilian communication, and why his incident reports contained observational details that suggested specialized training rather than casual awareness. Patricia's announcement that Metro Transit had been hosting federal security personnel operating under civilian covert entities created immediate confusion and whispered conversations among employees who were trying to process the implications of working alongside undercover agents. Patricia emphasized that the security operations had been essential for protecting Phoenix's transportation infrastructure from terrorist threats that most employees had been unaware of. Derek Thompson's confusion turned to concern when Patricia specifically mentioned Route 47 and its importance to federal intelligence gathering operations that had been monitoring potential terrorist activities for several months. Derek realized that his campaign against Bob Martinez might have inadvertently interfered with national security operations, but he remained convinced that Bob's performance issues were legitimate regardless of any security considerations. Emma Chen stepped forward to address the group with information that would completely reframe their understanding of Bob Martinez and his role within Metro Transit's operations. Emma explained that federal agencies had been investigating terrorist organizations that were targeting transportation infrastructure and that Metro Transit's cooperation had been essential for preventing attacks that could have caused mass casualties. The revelation that Bob Martinez was a federal security operative operating under civilian cover created immediate shock among employees who had spent months mocking his careful driving methods and systematic approach to passenger safety. Emma explained that Bob's seemingly excessive caution had actually been professional counter-surveillance and threat assessment techniques designed to identify and neutralize security risks. Mike O'Brien, who had participated in social media campaigns mocking Bob's performance, felt his face flush with embarrassment as Emma described how Bob's incident reports had provided critical intelligence about terrorist reconnaissance activities. Mike realized that his complaints about Bob's slow driving had been criticizing security procedures that were protecting thousands of civilian lives. James Wilson, who had maintained neutral silence during Derek's campaign against Bob, understood that his failure to defend Bob had contributed to harassment of a federal agent who was serving in one of the most dangerous and thankless assignments possible. James realized that Bob's patient endurance of workplace mockery had been protecting both his security mission and his colleagues' safety. Emma's presentation included specific examples of how Bob's work had contributed to preventing terrorist attacks, identifying hostile surveillance, and protecting critical infrastructure from reconnaissance activities that could have facilitated devastating strikes against Iran targets. Emma emphasized that Bob's methods had been developed through specialized training and real-world experience that far exceeded civilian transportation requirements. The disclosure that Derek Thompson's performance complaints had been amplified by external manipulation from terrorist organizations created stunned silence among employees who realized they had been unknowingly participating in activities that served hostile interests. Emma explained that federal agencies had evidence suggesting that the Desert Liberation Front had attempted to influence Metro Transit personnel decisions to remove security assets who threatened their operational objectives. Derek Thompson's face went pale as Emma described how his seemingly legitimate concerns about Route 47's efficiency had been supported by manipulated data and analysis provided by individuals who were later identified as terrorist sympathizers. Derek realized that his campaign against Bob had been exploited by hostile actors who recognized Bob as an obstacle to their attack planning. Patricia Hayes addressed Derek directly, explaining that his actions had not been intentionally treasonous but had been manipulated by sophisticated adversaries who specialized in exploiting civilian workplace conflicts to advance terrorist objectives. Patricia emphasized that Derek's experience demonstrated why operational security was essential and why federal operations required careful protection from inadvertent compromise. Tom Garcia, who had contributed maintenance data to Derek's presentation, understood that his technical analysis had been based on false assumptions about Bob's driving methods and vehicle utilization. Tom realized that Bob's systematic approach to equipment care and route management had actually extended vehicle life while serving security purposes that Tom hadn't been authorized to understand. The emergency meeting concluded with Patricia announcing that Metro Transit would be expanding its cooperation with federal security agencies and that employees would receive additional training about recognizing and reporting potential security threats. Patricia emphasized that the afternoon's successful prevention of terrorist attacks demonstrated the critical importance of transportation security and the value of cooperation between civilian and federal personnel. Sandra Kim approached Emma after the meeting to apologize for not recognizing Bob's true role and for allowing workplace harassment to continue without intervention. Sandra requested assignment to security liaison duties that would help her understand how transportation operations intersected with federal law enforcement and intelligence requirements.
Derek Thompson remained in the assembly area after other employees had departed, struggling to process the implications of learning that his months-long campaign as Robert Martinez had been influenced by terrorist organizations and had potentially compromised the nation's security operations.
Derek realized that he needed to completely reevaluate his assumptions about
Workplace performance and professional competence.
The public reckoning had revealed that Bob Martinez wasn't an incompetent bus driver
who needed additional training or reassignment to less demanding duties.
Bob was a highly skilled federal agent whose security mission had required him to endure systematic harassment while protecting civilian populations from terrorist threats that most people
never realized existed.
Emma Chen understood that the revelation would fundamentally change workplace dynamics at Metro Transit, but she also recognized that Bob's security mission would continue requiring
careful operational security
and professional discretion from colleagues who now understood the true nature of his work and its importance
to regional safety.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.